This lecture is on the uninhabitable, or at least unwelcoming, Earth. In December of 2015, 196 nations of the planet Earth agreed to do their best to keep global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius from a pre-industrial baseline. This was at the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties, also known as COP21. The agreement reached has become known as the Paris Agreement. What's more, these nations agreed to also pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. Sounds good, right? Now, the problem is that the global temperature has already risen by 2/3 that amount, 1 degree Celsius from prehistorical levels. What's more, and worse, the nations involved have only promised to reduce emissions, as the Paris Agreement has no enforcement mechanism. In less than 2 years after the COP21, the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, appointed by the United Nations to study the climate crisis, released a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius that suggested that a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise could happen in as little as 11 years, just 10 years from the time that I'm recording this, and almost certainly within 20 years if major cuts on global greenhouse gas emissions were not made immediately. Since we are not yet taking the necessary steps to make these cuts, a 1.5 degrees Celsius seems inevitable, and a 2 degree seems likely. Unfortunately, as the IPCC report made clear, even a 1.5 degree rise would have profound global consequences, and a 2 degree rise would obviously be still worse. But what sort of consequences would we be facing if we failed to stop global temperatures at 2 degrees, which now seems entirely possible, if not in fact likely? This is the question taken up by David Wallace Wells in a July 2017 New York Magazine article entitled The Uninhabitable Earth. Wallace Wells has incidentally subsequently written a book with the same title and published a follow-up article entitled We're Getting a Clearer Picture of the Climate Future, and It's Not as Bad as It Once Looked. The 2017 article lays out the consequences of climate change if we do not act quickly and decisively. Wallace Wells explains, this article is the result of dozens of interviews and exchanges with climatologists and researchers in the related fields and reflects hundreds of scientific papers on the subject of climate change. What follows is not a series of predictions of what will happen. And that will be determined in large part by the much less certain science of human response. Instead, it's a portrait of our best understanding of where the planet is heading absent of aggressive action. It's unlikely that all these warning scenarios will be fully realized, largely because of the devastation along with, what will shake our complacency. But those scenarios, and not the present climate, are the baseline. In fact, they are our schedule, unquote. While many authors focus on the impact of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise, Wallace Wells rightly notes that such a small rise in temperature is a best case, and at this point, probably unlikely scenario, especially as human activity has already warmed the Earth by 1 degree Celsius. With this in mind, Wallace Wells takes up the question of what the Earth and our lives would be like with the 2 to 4 degree Celsius rise, which is where we are headed if we do not act quickly. The uninhabitable Earth generated quite a bit of controversy, as many people, including some climate scientists, thought that he was being too alarmist. However, as Wallace Wells makes clear in the above quote, he is portraying just one possible future. He notes that it is unlikely that all of this will happen, as humanity at some point will, hopefully, wake up and act. However, if we do not, Wallace Wells paints a picture of where business as usual will take us. Incidentally, because a number of individuals have questioned the scenarios that he lays out, Wallace Wells has also created an annotated version of the article where he notes and responds to the objections. So here are a few questions for thought. Is Wallace Wells, in fact, too alarmist? While his objective seems to be to startle us into action by laying out what the future could hold if we do nothing, does he risk doing the exact opposite by incapacitating us with fear? There is certainly quite a bit of doom and gloom in the article. Expressed another way, how do you feel, or what do you want to do after putting down the article? Do you feel prompted to action, or did you simply want to cry? Number 2, regarding the above question, does taking an alarmist tack risk alienating certain readers? Climate change deniers and skeptics frequently refer to people who are trying to alert us to the dangers of climate change as, quote, climate change alarmists, as they characterize them as trying to frighten us into action. An obvious alarmist, in this sense, Wallace Wells fits into a category that some people might summarily dismiss. Number 3, Wallace Wells focuses on a number of specific consequences of climate change, including heat deaths, the end of food, climate plagues, unbreathable air, perpetual war, permanent economic collapse, poisoned oceans. Which did you find the most compelling and worrisome? Why? A final thought. Some people might be quick to dismiss Wallace Wells as he is looking forward to an uncertain future. However, a quick look to the recent past makes it hard to dismiss Wallace Wells as simply an alarmist. At the close of the 20-teens, journalists Sarah Roots Gutzman and Linda O'Connor published an article entitled 7 Numbers That Show How Dire Climate Change Got This Decade. Allow me to end by repeating them. 1. The past 5 years were the hottest ever recorded on the planet. 2. 4 of the 5 largest wildfires in California history happened this decade. 3. 6 Category 5 hurricanes tore through the Atlantic region in the past 4 years. 4. The Arctic Sea ice cover dropped about 13% this decade. 5. Floods with a 0.1% chance of happening, i.e. 1 in 1,000 chance of happening in any given year, became a frequent occurrence. 6. There were more than $100 billion climate disasters, double from the previous decade. 7. Meanwhile, we pumped a record 4.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the air in 2019. So, this is the class discussion for the uninhabitable Earth. Note that the following observations, which are in italics, have not been paraphrased or altered, though I do correct the occasional typo, because of space concerns, often just part of the comment is reproduced here along with my reply. In working through these, I will first quote an observation by a student, followed by my thoughts. Here's the first observation. After reading the article, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, I felt more worried and scared rather than wanting to jump up to take action. Although this article said nothing but the truth, it left me feeling more discouraged than anything. Good point. As I explained in the article that the actions do not need to be taken now are more drastic because the action should have been started years ago. But instead, the health of our world and the atmosphere was put on the back burner. In the chapter of Climate Crisis 101 explaining the course overview, I noted that one of the difficulties in communicating the climate crisis is that people might feel, as this person succinctly notes, scared rather than wanting to jump up to take action. However, allow me to again repeat what I explained in that section, namely that just the first 3 chapters of Climate Crisis 101 are taken up with the problem. As we shall see, there is plenty that we can do to resolve this issue if we act decisively and act now. I hope this material will want to make you jump up to take action. Next comment. In all honesty, I thought that this article would be like every other article addressing climate change that I have read. I know that the Earth is warming. I know that the rate of which it warms is accelerating. And I know that if action isn't taken, the future of this planet and its inhabitants won't look too bright. I thought that this article would be just as redundant, an embellishment of these 3 points. What I came to realize after getting only 2.5 paragraphs deep into the uninhabitable earth was how incredibly pretentious my attitude toward the subject had been. There was so much to learn. Make no mistake, anthropogenic climate change is not simple. Even if you understand the underlying science, which would be an accomplishment in its own right, there is much more to address here. As David Wallace Wells makes clear, the societal implications of all this are complex and profound, as there are remedies that we need to enact to mitigate the climate crisis, societal remedies. Climate Crisis 101 is, as the name suggests, an introduction to the problem. However, as this person rightly notes, there is, quote, so much to learn. Consequently, think of Climate Crisis 101 as an introduction to something that you may, in fact, want to learn more about, either through coursework or just by keeping up with what is happening in our rapidly changing world. Next quote. I've come to understand that my mother and grandparents' generation set my generation up for failure due to not taking into consideration their anthropogenic climate impact. It is in the hands of my generation to save the planet. Wallace's alarmist tone made my fear for the future of my kids clear. The future of the kids I wish to have one day. Nonetheless, it filled me with fear that motivated me to do something about it. Take, for instance, acts and signs that you see in regard to smoking tobacco. They defiantly use an alarmist tone to encourage people to stop consuming them. Perhaps setting up warning signs on gas pumps and flight tickets, such as those seen on cigarette packets, would motivate my generation and others to make a change for our Earth. As we shall see in detail, there is a whole chapter of Climate Crisis 101 devoted to the topic. My generation did indeed set up the current generation coming on the scene, that of my students, for failure. Consequently, it is, quote, in the hands of your generation to save planet Earth, unquote. This is a great example of something that we could do to help mitigate the climate crisis. Put warning signs on gas pumps or flight tickets such as those seen on cigarette packs. Although health warnings are required on every package of cigarettes sold in the United States, in other countries, like Germany, for example, the warnings are especially blunt and powerful, such as, quote, smoking can cause a slow and painful death. What if we had similarly powerful warnings on gas pumps with the key term used by David Wallace Wells, and that is, burning fossil fuels is making the earth uninhabitable for future human beings. As we shall repeatedly see in Climate Crisis 101, there are all sorts of little things that we can do to help mitigate the climate crisis. Some of them, like this suggestion for warning labels, would be, surprisingly easy to do. I also suspect that it would be surprisingly effective. This makes clear that there are things that anyone could do to help with the climate crisis, such as, creating a viral online campaign designed to pressure politicians to require such warnings. By the way, if it were up to me, I would go further by drawing attention to the fact that over 50 million people are annually killed or injured worldwide by automobiles, and that, for the average American, automobile use is responsible for a quarter of their carbon footprint. Imagine if every shiny new car had a prominent label warning printed across both sides. Cars kill people and the planet. I'm just saying, it's an idea. The next quote. Rather than give a simple breakdown of the statistics, David Wallace Wells challenges his readers to drop the past and present and instead project their thoughts into the future. He makes us realize that many parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, have next to no hope in surviving our current rate of climate change. In action, Wallace Wells firmly grounds his readers into the hard reality. In addition, Wallace Wells firmly grounds his readers into the hard reality of what we face. The world is on track to surpass the goals set by the Paris Agreement. This comment is succinct and to the point. The quote, let me quote the student again, "The world is on track to surpass the goal set by the Paris Agreement." And quote, "Parts of the world, such as Bangladesh, have next to no hope in surviving our current rate of climate change." Close quote. The Paris Agreement, which was signed at COP21 in 2015, is a promise by the nearly 200 countries on Earth that they would take up the challenge of mitigating the climate crisis. Since it took decades to extract that promise, it was quite an accomplishment. Unfortunately, since then, little or nothing has been done. Second. Why? Because this is just a promise. There is absolutely no way to enforce it. Simply put, the Paris Agreement has no teeth. As a consequence, we are well on our way to surpassing the goals set in Paris. One way or another, this will impact every country and every being, including the human ones on Earth. However, as this comment rightly notes, some countries and some people will be more impacted than others, with Bangladesh being a prime example. We refer to this as a climate justice issue because it is simply unjust that certain people in certain countries will suffer more than others. In this sense, especially so, as Bangladesh did very little to contribute to the climate crisis, which was overwhelmingly caused by the wealthy countries on the planet. If every high school student were to read David Wallace Wells's work, I believe that the world would finally see rapid climate change. If you ask the average person on the street what we need to mitigate the climate crisis, I suspect that many of them would say that we need more and better wind turbines, solar arrays, and electric cars. However, we also need more and better climate education, which, as far as I am concerned, should begin in elementary school. And not only in the United States, as 40% of people on the planet have never heard of the climate crisis. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done, as fossil fuel affiliates are staging an extraordinary campaign of disinformation designed to confuse the public. Still, we need to do all that we can to counter this and to make the people of the Earth aware of the horrific consequences of our actions. I found it to be strikingly interesting about the effects of climate change I will have on our oceans in particular. I always knew that our oceans were being polluted and marine life is being threatened. However, learning about the concept of ocean acidification really changed my perspective on the harmful effects of greenhouse gases. Many people are indeed aware of the visible impact that we are having on our oceans, such as our polluting them with all sorts of plastics. However, when it comes to dumping CO2 into our atmosphere, because we, one, cannot see the impact it has on ocean temperature, and two, how it increases the acidity of the planet's oceans, many people are completely unaware of the consequences of these actions, unfortunately. Other than studying the oceans for these changes, and by that I mean through temperature measurements and checking pH levels, we generally only become aware of them when we see their impact, such as through the wholesale death of our planet's coral reefs. This brings us back to the previous point, as we need to educate people about the horrific consequences of our actions. Depending on the car that you drive, for every mile that you drive, you could be releasing as much as 1 pound of CO2 into the atmosphere. Not only will this contribute to the warming of the atmosphere, and hence oceans, as they are in immediate contact with the atmosphere, across 75% of the Earth's surface. But in addition, most of the CO2 will be directly absorbed into the oceans, thereby increasing its acidity and making our oceans uninhabitable for quite a bit of life in the oceans. Regarding the previous point, perhaps we could come up with a whole series of warning labels to paint across new cars. Another option might be "Cars are killing our oceans." Next comment. The closing statistic and facts at the end of this video really put the effects of climate change on the weather into perspective. It is a daunting reality that so much has happened over the past decade alone. It makes me wonder if slowing or stopping climate change is even something that is possible, or if it's just a part of the Earth's evolution. As I have previously noted, prior to the last decade or so, people used to routinely ask me when the climate crisis was going to begin. This is now a nonsensical question, as it has already begun. As this comment rightly notes, quote, so much has happened over the past decade alone. Extreme weather events, such as common and more powerful, more common and more powerful hurricanes, droughts, wildfires. It's important to note that weather and climate are different. Weather refers to the short-term atmospheric conditions, while climate is the weather of a specific region over a long period of time. Climate change refers to long-term changes. However, our changing climate is now definitely impacting our weather, which has now changed as well. Regarding the second point made in this comment, quote, if stopping or slowing down climate change is even something that is possible, or if it's just part of the Earth's evolution. It is absolutely the case that we can slow down climate change and mitigate this crisis. Climate Crisis 101 is designed to explain how we can do just that. As to the question of whether or not this is part of the Earth's evolution, this is definitely not a natural occurrence, but rather is principally being caused by human beings. In other words, the Earth would not be evolving in this direction if we were not doing the things that we're doing. However, this issue can be approached another way. So back in the middle of the 20th century, the physicist Enrico Fermi wondered why there is no convincing evidence that the Earth has been visited by intelligent extraterrestrial civilizations. Given that the universe is so large and likely filled with habitable planets, Fermi calculated that we should definitely have been contacted or visited. Why haven't we? A recent study suggests that intelligent species may simply, as part of their natural evolution, inevitably wipe themselves out through something like, quote, nuclear holocaust or runaway climate change. This would mean that the overwhelming majority of peak Milky Way civilizations are already gone. In this sense, the climate crisis could be a natural consequence as it signals the zenith and corresponding collapse of human civilization on the Earth. This is, of course, a horrific thought. However, I am firmly of the opinion that we can, beat Fermi's odds and get through this, and perhaps one day venture out to meet other civilizations. David Wallace Wells presents statistics that put these issues into perspective and on a scale that help me to understand the severity of global warming and what it has done to our planet and what will happen in the future if we fail to take action. Reference to the time in which the Earth is likely to become uninhabitable gives the reader an understanding of how little time there is left relative to their lifespan. Related to the above point of when the climate crisis is going to begin, as I noted it's already started, is the complementary question of how and when it will end. As David Wallace Wells makes clear, nearly all of the consequences that scientists have laid out, which he is reporting on, will largely happen in this century. In other words, the horrific effects of anthropogenic climate change will largely occur in a single lifetime, that of my current students. Consequently, just as the climate crisis was largely brought about by a single generation, mine, I'll explore this issue in some detail in the chapter on climate and generation, the full brunt of the climate crisis will be felt by a single generation. Of course, it won't stop there, as it will be felt by many subsequent generations, but the first generation to experience this, my students' generation, will see and feel it all. Consequently, as this comment rightly noted, David Wallace Wells gives the reader an understanding of how little time there is left to act to mitigate the climate crisis relative to their lifespan. After reading the article, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, I would say this article was more thought-provoking and interesting than most of the environmental films and readings that I've read in the past. A lot of environmental articles usually conclude by saying global warming will result in tremendous amounts of world disasters, such as sea level rise causing cities to flood, more natural disasters, or by some type of economic crisis. But with Wallace Wells, he goes on to further his article by adding in how this dramatic environmental change will deeply impact human lives. This is an important point. When we think about the climate crisis, we often think about it in terms of the impact that it will have on the climate and the environment, such as floods, droughts, wildfires, and all that. Of course, this is accurate, as all this and much more is already happening. We sometimes also look at how the crisis will impact life on Earth, such as by killing off coral reefs and by bringing about the planet's sixth extinction event. However, as David Wallace Wells in his comment make clear, quote, this dramatic environmental change will deeply impact human lives, close quote. Millions, in some cases hundreds of millions of people will starve, be forced to migrate, and will die as a result of the climate crisis. Consequently, even if someone were horrifically selfish and didn't care about the planet and its remarkable breadth of life, mitigating the climate crisis just makes sense, as it may well reduce your personal suffering in the future, as well as the suffering of any progeny that you may have. But the fact is, we really need to care about the planet and its life, even if just for selfish reasons. As I've noted, nearly 1 billion people rely on coral reef ecosystems for food, especially protein. If we allow coral reefs to die, 1 billion human beings will suffer the consequences. Part 2, heat death, did a great job of highlighting how the change in the climate could result in direct casualties via heat. It brings the question of what would happen in the case of extreme heat rise. The poorest areas do not have air conditioning nor the ability to migrate to a cooler climate. How would this additional problem be addressed by these nations? Nations such as Iraq and India would struggle with how lower class and poor infrastructure. I was also very surprised to see how people in El Salvador are already experiencing the effects of climate change. How indeed will we deal with the fact that changes, quote, in climate could result in direct casualties via heat? Mumbai is India's second largest populated city with roughly 20 million people. Because it's in a tropical climate, this means the maximum temperature is more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit for nearly a month. A 2009 study calculated that the potential of cooling demand in metropolitan Mumbai is about 24% of demand for the entire United States. In other words, if Mumbai is required to convert to air conditioning to allow the city to remain habitable, it would require 1/4 of the electricity demanded for cooling by the entire United States for just this one city. If vast portions of the earth are made uninhabitable because of high temperatures, it would require an extraordinary amount of energy to allow the people there to survive. Of course, migration, would also be a possibility for some people, but not all, but not for everyone, as some neighboring countries might close their borders to migrants. I know, for some countries like the United States, this sounds unimaginable. After all, would our government be morally fine with closing our borders to people in desperate need? And if we did, would we actually try to build an enormous wall spanning nearly 2,000 miles at our southern border in order to keep migrants out? I know. When I put it that way, it sounds almost unthinkable. Unfortunately, as you know, the idea has indeed occurred to people who thought it was, in fact, a good idea. It's truly frightening to think that we could enter into an era where, of even greater nationalism than we have today, made possible because of vast migrations of people fleeing climate change. The end of the article explains what needs to be done in order to hopefully not permanently destroy the planet. Wallace outlines the solutions as follows. Cut carbon emissions from industry and energy by half, each decade. Get emissions from and use to zero. There must be technology that can extract carbon from the atmosphere at a rate 2 times as fast as plants can. We need to take these extreme measures right away before it's too late. This comment is perfectly to the point. When you put it that way, it seems simple enough. And in a way, it's just that simple. We need 1, to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and 2, do what we can to extract the emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. If we can succeed at this, then we can not only stop the rise of emissions, but actually reduce them, and in the process, turn back the clock to a time when atmospheric CO2 levels were at a manageable level. Although atmospheric CO2 stood at around 280 parts per million for thousands of years up into Shakespeare's time, I think that it's pretty safe to say that setting a goal a little more above that would be acceptable. Say 315 parts per million, which is what atmospheric CO2 levels were the year that I was born, 1959. Of course, this is not to say that it will be hard to do. This won't be hard to do. Not the least of which because we currently have no meaningful legislation in the U.S. to rule on GHG emissions from industry, nor have people, especially Americans, shown much interest in reducing their personal greenhouse gas emissions by changing their habits, things like driving, flying, eating beef, buying fast fashion, and so forth. Finally, we do not presently have the technology to practically and economically extract carbon from the atmosphere. Unfortunately, much of the research into carbon capture and sequestration, or storage, also known as CCS, is being done by fossil fuel companies so that they can continue to profit from extracting fossil fuels. In essence, their position has been, if you keep letting us extract and burn fossil fuels, we will figure out a way of pulling the resultant CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is, of course, a very convoluted course of action, especially as the simpler solution is to stop extracting the fossil fuels from the earth to begin with. However, as there is no money in this for the fossil fuel industry, they are pushing this so-called solution. Not to be pessimistic or fatalistic, but throughout the article, I felt like I was reading a manual on how to create mass extinction. Hypothetically, what if the human race, for some inexplicable reason, wanted to make the Earth as uninhabitable as possible, not only for our species, but for all life on the planet? I know, this sounds a little like the Death Star from the Star Wars franchise. Except that, rather than destroying the planet itself, such an undertaking would just kill as much life as possible, as well as render extinct as many species as possible. Could destruction on such a planetary level be achieved? And if so, how? Setting aside that attempting this would be downright irrational, it seems to me that human beings have not only come up with 2 entirely plausible ways of bringing this about, but came close to doing the first and are in the process of enacting the second. The first is the idea of mutually assured destruction, which was developed during the Cold War, and which is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy in which a full-scale use of nuclear weapons by 2 or more opposing sides would cause complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. In addition to ensuring the annihilation of both the attacker and the defender, this could profoundly impact on all life, as detonating as few as 100 nuclear warheads could initiate something called a nuclear winter by blasting particles high into the atmosphere where they would blanket the Earth for some period of time, thereby cooling the planet. This is in essence the same thing that happened during the 5th extinction event when an asteroid hit the Earth, thereby sending, particles high into the atmosphere and causing a similar cooling of the planet that brought about the extinction of the dinosaurs. Whether or not 100 nuclear warheads could bring about a nuclear winter is something that scientists still debate. However, It is estimated that the United States produced more than 70,000 nuclear warheads since 1945, more than all the other nuclear weapon states combined. The Soviet Union, and that's now Russia, has produced approximately 55,000 nuclear weapons since 1949. In other words, if the United States and Russia were intent on mutually assured destruction, together they could explode 1,000 times more nuclear weapons than the amount that might trigger a nuclear winter. Consequently, it might seem that this is the closest thing that we have to a Death Star. However, there is a second option. We could, for hundreds of years, devote our global economy to digging up and burning fossil fuels. Doing so would have the opposite effect of the global climate, as it would dramatically heat rather than cool the planet. However, there is considerable evidence that this would be an effective strategy. While the extinction event brought about an end to the era of dinosaurs was caused by cooling of the planet, the other four major extinction events on Earth were caused by global warming, brought about through the rise of greenhouse gases, principally CO2, in the atmosphere. Since, as David Wallace Wells notes, we are currently releasing greenhouse gases at a rate that is 10 times what it was during the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which killed 97% of all life on our planet, this approach may in fact be the closest thing that we have to a Death Star. Apologies for framing the climate crisis in such a horrific way. However, as David Wallace Wells notes, if we continue to burn fossil fuels at the current rate, we risk making our once welcoming planet uninhabitable for a great deal of life on Earth, including human beings. Thank you.